Peter, thanks for joining Randstad Technology Digital and Data video podcast. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks, man. Yeah, pretty good.
Oh, good to hear it. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and we'll start digging into your role and Pushpay and the journey that you've been on.
Cool. So my name's Pete Goodman. I work at Pushpay. I've been there about 6 years now, just over 6 years. And so I'm official title is the Director of Site Reliability Engineering. And so I look after the Site Reliability Engineering, or SRE team. I also look after the data team and our security team. And so, yeah, as I say, I've been here a little while. Obviously, I'm not from New Zealand. I'm from Ireland. And so I've been in New Zealand about 13 years now, but ultimately ended up at Pushpay, and yeah, loving it. Really good.
No, excellent. Well, talk us through a bit of your journey, obviously, coming over. How have you ended up at Pushpay?
Well, originally I was living in Edinburgh. I was working for financial organizations there, banks. And so making like internal systems, I was just a developer, a .NET developer. And then when I came to New Zealand, I started working in a few different places. I worked my way through the kind of industry, got to know a few people. And then, I met a few folks that were getting involved in this early startup that I knew. And they basically tapped me on the shoulder and say, hey, you should really come work with us and see what it's like. And it was my first time working for a startup at like really early stage. But yeah, obviously it worked because I've been here ever since. So yeah.
I mean, it's been a fascinating journey. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on, because you've been there right from the very start, if I'm not mistaken. There was only a handful of you.
Yeah, there was a couple of years in, but it was just before we really started to ramp up. And so as I joined, there was maybe about 7 developers, 6 or 7, something like that. And so, yeah, it was really, really early on, yeah.
So your role now, just talk us through in a bit more detail what your role entails and what it is exactly.
My role at the moment is looking after the site reliability engineering team. And so SRE is an interesting discipline. The way we look at what we do is we want to enable all of the other engineers to own their own destiny in a sense, or own the product that they actually developed. And so they need to be able to have the right tools and the right experience to be able to manage or operate what they run in production. And so as a developer, and I was a developer most of my career, often we don't think about what happens after our code is left, our computer, like what happens to it when it's running for a customer. And this is surely the most important part of the software that you build. That's when it's actually doing its job. But it's not something as a developer, and when I was a developer anyway, definitely at the start, that I thought about a lot. And so we kind of help teams understand that. We also look after all of the infrastructure and monitoring tools and all that sort of stuff. And so that's where SRE fits in. It's kind of an interesting discipline. But yeah, for me, it's about enabling other people, to be honest, and being like that kind of providing a service to the rest of the engineers.
Because obviously there's, DevOps and SRE, it's blown up. I've been in New Zealand for 2 years and, it was only just about starting. But since, probably November, October 2019, something like, the job market has gone, crazy, with DevOps and, SRE type engineers. What is DevOps and how does SRE fit into DevOps? Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So DevOps is something that came about a while ago, maybe probably 2010, something like that, I think. There were mainly these 2 silos in engineering that were building up. There was people that looked after, development, who developed applications, and then there was an operations team that looked after operating what happened, again, when your code is running for somebody else. And so the idea of DevOps kind of came around. A bunch of people around Flickr and companies like this were thinking about, what happens when these people work closer together? And so they started to break down this silo that existed because it really wasn't constructive. It was, well, I build it and then I chuck it over the fence and then you operate it. And then if there's a problem, you chuck it back over the fence. And none of this was really conducive to like the best outcomes for the customer. And so what people started to do was break this down a little bit. And so people like John Allspaw did talks on what they were doing at Flickr. And a few other people kind of picked up on this, and they started a DevOps conference called DevOps Days. That was where the name got coined. It was a guy called Patrick Dubois actually did that. And so what was interesting is that this was just all about trying to work better together. And so it's really actually a cultural change in the way that we engineer software. And so to me, DevOps now it's gone so far since those early days. And then now it's starting to become the way we expect teams to operate and the way that we expect to build software and run it. And so what it means for me is like this idea of a silo between these two teams should fundamentally change. Like you should be able to understand what your code does when it runs for other people, and therefore you should have the tools to do it. So these tools shouldn't be the domain of somebody specialized that sits somewhere else. Like this is all the things that you should care about whenever you're writing software. And so you should look at what happens when your customers run it. When it goes wrong for a customer, you should be able to tighten that feedback loop so things happen a lot quicker rather than waiting for that to come back over the fence and a ticket to get raised and all of that. Like we wanted to break all of this down. And so DevOps started coming along with a few other things were happening at the time, like continuous delivery. So trying to deploy more than just, once a quarter or once a month. How about we do it 5 times a day? Like, wouldn't that be better if we could just react that quickly? And so for me, DevOps is really about that cultural shift and that cultural change into continuous delivery. The way I like to think of it really is like if you could empower everybody with like an intolerance towards friction, that to me is DevOps. It's trying to get past those things that stop you delivering the best outcomes for your customer and reacting as quickly as you can in order to fix things or to progress or build what they need. So that's DevOps to me, to be honest.
No, and it's really interesting to hear this because obviously Pushpay, you've been quite fundamental in implementing, a DevOps culture, here at Pushpay, obviously about the blameless culture, which we'll get into later. No, that's good. It's just very important to clear this up because I speak to people in the market and not everyone understands, really,
yeah,
what
and
DevOps is and what people think it's, about a bunch of tools that,
Yeah.
you bunch them together and that's it. But it's not necessarily the case. It's a mindset, right?
Yeah, fundamentally for us, like we had to concede this a little bit because when we started the team, we knew we didn't want to call it DevOps because, in my opinion, you don't solve the dev and ops problem by putting a DevOps team in the middle. That's not bringing them closer together, right? And so we knew that we wanted some other name for this. And at the time, Google were starting to use this term called site reliability engineering. And we're not Google, right? But there was no other really good terms around at the time. And funnily enough, when we started to hire people for SREs, nobody knew what SRE was. And so we had to call them DevOps whenever we were looking to hire people. So we need to hire a DevOps. And then when we got them, we said, actually, really, this is site reliability engineering, and this is the way we think about it. And it's quite difficult because people at the time knew that DevOps was a thing, but they didn't really understand what that meant. And so I think now these like SRE is a more industry accepted term. We're seeing it used a lot more. And for me, it better describes the role that we play. But DevOps, better describes the culture as a whole and its shift in engineering culture.
Cool. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper then. So let's start from the early days really at Pushpay. So, how this kind of DevOps culture has developed and matured. Just take us on a bit of a journey, if you would. So when we met, we discussed about kind of the things like the architecture chat and the pit of success. So talk us a little bit about what it was like in those early days.
In the early days, we had to find people. The biggest problem that you have at the very start is getting the right people so you can build the right thing quickly enough to understand if you've got a business model. And so we had to get the best developers we had. And so I got brought on because I was part of a meetup group called the Architecture Chat that was run by Alex Henderson, who's now our VP of Engineering. And he was really good at just kind of getting the right people together. And so we managed to find a lot of really good engineers to bootstrap the start of development. There was already a few developers on board, and then we really started to grow out of that by cannibalizing essentially that group of people and hiring them on. And so we started to find that we had a bunch of people with a bunch of experience and been to lots of different places and had seen things done badly and had real aspirations for doing things as well as they could. And so we knew we wanted to get continuous delivery and other aspects of DevOps culture and that blameless culture you said earlier. And we wanted to bring these things in and experiment with them, but move fast is the most important thing. So we had to prove that we could make a business out of this and so that we could actually develop things and get customers. And so in those early days, I was already working at a previous company trying to get DevOps and continuous delivery working somewhere else. And when I came on board, I just knew I wanted to get the experience to know what good looks like. And it's one of the things you can do in a startup is that you can really set the direction of what good should look like. And so there was a bunch of people who already were really interested in setting that direction well. And joining that ship was really inspirational for me at the time. It gave me the ability to really start to figure out, like, what does this really mean to run, 5 deployments a day? What does it really mean to learn from failures as quickly as possible? And so we started that really, really early on and tried to persist that culture the whole way through the last, 6 years as it is. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey. As I said, like, friction is your biggest enemy whenever you start to grow that way. And I think that's something we definitely ran into and something we constantly have to try and address, because adding more people and growing as fast as we have, you really learn where those friction points are in an organization and in engineering, and you have to address them quite quickly. Otherwise, you will never be able to meet the kind of goals that you need.
Can you give us an example of where friction might occur? Give us a few examples.
Yeah, a great one is the way that you make decisions. And so if you centralize your decision making, like, let's say you have like an architect or like somebody who looks after the whole direction of software architecture or infrastructure architecture, something like that. If you rely on one role to solve all of those problems, or each come up with those ideas, or to sign off on everything, then you can really quickly find that scaling out the number of people will create a pressure point in that role. And so democratizing decision making is a really interesting part of scaling. And so, a lot of people, Spotify did talk quite a lot about like a guild model and tribes and things like this. And so we borrowed little pieces from really successful companies like that. We have guilds, we have people that get together and discuss problems that are of a like type. So whether it's infrastructure or front end or security or database or something like that, we have these different groups that can get together and make recommendations, and therefore we can democratize a lot of that decision making so that we can actually move faster. To be honest, that's a great example of just how you kind of address some of those friction points.
Yeah. No, I understand. It makes sense. It's becoming very popular, right? The Spotify model and kind of guilds and this agile way of working. Because scaling, right, is one of the hardest things to do. How have Pushpay managed to scale at the rate that they have without breaking?
As I kind of mentioned before, like there's this idea of feedback loops, and so how do you learn from the mistakes that you make along the way? All right, and so like you can't afford for everybody to make all of the same mistakes all of the time. So one of those is like as a process around postmortems or around incident reviews. That's a really good way to address scaling issues that appear. From a technology perspective, we had to make a lot of changes along the way. When I first started, we had servers that were sitting in Auckland, in Albany, I think. And that wasn't really useful because all of our customers were in the US. And so making them come across the Pacific for a web page was, mean. And so we decided, well, we had to move to a different provider. And so we moved to a different provider in Rackspace, I think was at the time. And then making those decisions from there, saying, well, okay, like we're able to scale to a certain amount. What can we do next? So moving to the commodity cloud, like we moved to Amazon, AWS. And some of the reasoning there was we needed to be able to react again a lot more quickly. And so what if we need a new database server? We can't, start a sales order, get it signed off, and have somebody provision it and take a couple of weeks or months for a server to appear and then use it. Like we needed it today, and so moving to the AWS cloud, for example, is a great way to solve that type of scaling problems. It allows you to react a lot more quickly to the changing demands that you have over time. The other thing is, that's technology, and that's been kind of interesting. It's been, a big journey for us, and a lot of people now are starting to make that move to the cloud, which is it's basically an expectation now, I think, of a lot of people. Another aspect, I suppose, is just people. Like, how do you hire enough people to be able to build what you need. And so how do you make sure you make good hires, and how do you make sure you hire the right people and move like that? And so that was definitely an issue for us in the early days, and it all starts with the technology stack. A lot of people believe that you pick the best technology for the job, or the thing that you want to build, or your favorite technology. A lot of people do, but they neglect the fact that you should really, if you want to grow fast, you should pick a technology stack where you can hire people. If you pick some, artisanal kind of, language that hardly anybody knows, then you're going to find it quite difficult, right?
Very difficult, yeah.
And so for us, .NET was really good. There are a lot of .NET developers in New Zealand, and Auckland especially. And so being on the .NET stack really helped us. So we were able to pick up people in the Auckland community and hire them. We also changed the way that we hire people. So we have quite a long kind of extended, you probably know, like an extended kind of hiring loop.
Yeah, indeed, I know.
And so one of the aspects in the way that we hire people is, you want people to be excited to work at where you are. And so you want to, like, especially in the early days, nobody knew who we were. And we had to explain to people why they would want to work here. And so one of the things we did really early on was like take them out for coffee and just sell them on the idea of Pushpay. Like, tell them what you do, tell them how you do engineering, like tell them how you live by the things that you put on your job ads, and tell them what it's really like. And once they're through that stage, they're actually invested. You'll get the most out of them in any interview loop.
Yeah.
The next thing we did, you put them through some kind of, normally you'll have a technical interview or something like that. And really, for me, this is really about how can I figure out if this person can learn, right? Because if you're moving fast enough, things are changing. The knowledge that people bring with them is useful, but it's often transient. Like you want people that can pick up information and learn something on the fly, learn it quickly. And if you test for that in your interview loop, you'll get people that can adapt. And what you need when you grow fast is people that can adapt. And so that became really important for us. The other thing we do is bring people in for an entire day to work in the office and see what it's like. And it's a two-way street. You get to see what it's like working with somebody in the office. Obviously, it's quite difficult right now in this climate and during a pandemic, but you can adapt. And so making sure people know what it's like to work for a day inside the company is really good, and vice versa. You get to know what it's like to work with them for a day. And so the hiring loop to us was quite important as well, and that helped us scale quite quickly because we had really good candidates at the time that they got through the interview process.
Yeah, no, I really like Pushpay's interview process. First and foremost, I like the fact that you create the buy-in right from the very start. Some companies that I work with and recruit for, they don't create as much buy-in as I'd say Pushpay. It is very much a two-way street that I've found. Investing in that kind of interview or candidate experience, I found that right from the very start with the coffees, etc. And then moving obviously, a life in a day of spending time with Pushpay where they go through the technical tests. So, I think Pushpay have done a great job on that and in that interview process. Yep. How do you mentioned learning on the fly. What do you look for and how do you measure learning on the fly in interviews? Is there anything in particular that you focus on or that a particular candidate says?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always interesting talking about your interview process. A good test of it is whether it kind of gives people the secrets of how to pass the interview, to be honest. But for us, for me personally, I try to teach somebody in an interview a certain subject. And I look to see if they can learn that subject and apply it. And normally there will be some other questions that lean on it later, and it demonstrates whether they've actually been able to take on board what you said, which is, to be fair, quite difficult in an interview scenario. None of us are, that relaxed during an interview. But whether they've taken on board what you said, if they've been able to model it, like if they've been able to learn from it and kind of figure out what you're talking about, and then to be able to apply it later in another context. And that's a really good thing to try and tease out during an interview. It's not just, name all of the types in in .NET or, tell me what the stack in a heap or, these types of questions are good. The good is show that somebody has first principles they can fall back on. But really, Like, what do they do first day on the job? What are they going to have to do? They're going to have to learn. And you want to see if people can learn and people can adapt as quickly as possible. And so we've had some great hires out of this, especially like in my SRE team. I've got quite a disparate group of people that have all, are all really good at adapting and learning new technologies, and that's what we need, to be honest.
Was there a particular mode that you looked for in, when you were bringing on people to join your team? Did you look for people who had more of a programming background, more of an infrastructure background, a mix of, because it's always quite interesting when you speak to people hiring in this space, kind of what skills they really need. Did you have a preference at all?
I had a preference, I suppose. I've been, like every preference that I've ever had, I've been proven wrong over the years. And so one of the things that I look for is I look to see what is the current makeup of the team, and do we have all of the different skills that we need in order to meet our goals. And so at times I did hire a bunch of ops style people, especially in the SRE, because there's certain things you need to know from an ops background that developers don't know. You should test your restores, not your backups. These little things that like operations people have learned for years. But you also then, things have changed over time because now infrastructure is code. And so we use Terraform, so like all of our infrastructure is defined in code. And so after a while, you need people who can manage large code bases, understand how to refactor code. And that's where obviously your people with development experience are going to come in. And it really needs to look at what stage you are in your maturity as to what you're going to need. But the important thing is, sure, look at the backgrounds, the skills that you have in the team at the time and the challenges that you're facing, and just hire the appropriate people that you think you're going to need. And I think that's definitely changed over time. I, as I say, came from a development background, so I definitely biased towards hiring developers, but I have some great people from an operations background that have also adapted into SRE really, really well.
Let's talk a bit more about that kind of adoption of cloud, and that process. Kind of what did you find were, reducing slowdown? Give the audience maybe an idea of kind of that journey from transitioning from obviously like Rackspace, like you mentioned, but to the cloud. How did that look like in a bit more detail, and what sort of challenges did you face?
So the first thing was to build a relationship, and so we knew, like, we had to look at a bunch of different cloud providers, and we knew where we wanted to go at the time. And still, AWS is the biggest and most experienced cloud provider out there, and so we settled on them quite early, and then we built a relationship and said, hey, how should we build in this thing? What have you learned from other people? And so getting to the point at which we could build out all of our code to provision all of our infrastructure inside AWS was really important. So we spent a bunch of time on that, to be honest, and standing things up, understanding how they worked, and then breaking them, and then understanding how they worked after that. And we did this. We took a fair amount of time to do it. I think we probably spent a year all up, from the very first discussions to the time that we moved to the AWS cloud. But it was that during that time we were hiring people, as well as training them up, as well as kind of designing systems. And so I think like leaning into the relationships and people that you know in the cloud provider that you're using. Talking to other folks. So we talked to people at Xero, we talked to people at other companies about exactly what they're building and how they were building it. And building on those relationships. But New Zealand's great for this. There are a lot of companies out there, they're more than willing to help you understand how you make this move. I find those relationships are the ones that I lean on quite a lot. And so then, through that, we were able to build out a best-in-class solution inside AWS. And then, there's different programs that you can go through to kind of assess what you're doing. AWS is like a well-architected framework. And so just get that feedback loop again going and understand where can we improve here, where can we get better. For us, for the cloud itself, it was about breaking down all of the stuff that we did manually, get rid of all of that, automate as much as you can, automate pretty much everything. You can never do 100%. Get as much as you can, automate it, and then deploy it from there, break it and fix it, and figure it out and move forward. And so keep learning. It's been pretty successful so far. So
yeah, you've got your cloud service provider, you're scaling. what about the culture? Because what I've found is that the hardest thing to develop is that blameless culture, and it seems that Pushpay have really worked on that.
Yeah,
Work on that. So talk to me a bit more about how you have kind of created this blameless culture at Pushpay.
yeah. So the blameless culture, like for us, it started almost at the start whenever I joined, and so the other engineers that we had at the time, especially our previous VP of engineering, brought this idea of blameless culture, and so we wanted to experiment and see if this would work. And we knew we needed to move fast. Like that was really important. We knew that like we'd get this thing off the ground and be as to be able to grow at the speeds that we wanted to, we needed to move really fast. When you move fast, you're going to break things. Like, things are inevitably going to break. Now, it's how you treat those failures that's really important. And so if you want to move as fast as possible and you accept that failure is a part of doing that, then you're going to need to learn from those failures. And learning from them means looking at them, figuring out what went wrong, and then fixing it and doing it again. Now, blame is really important in this game, because blame is the thing that, like, if you have it, then progress slows down and stops. And the reason is that if let's say you have a bug in production, or a machine gets destroyed accidentally, or whatever it might be that brings down your site. Now, when you go looking for a cause, like a root cause, as we typically do, or typically been taught to do in a lot of these processes, like look for the root cause. There's going to be one thing that happened. When you do that, you're going to end up with a name. You're not going to end up with a cause. You're going to end up with Dave. And so randomly, we don't have anybody called Dave in SRE. But if you do find, like, you search for root cause, you're going to end up with a person. And then if you blame them, Dave's not going to do anything after that. Right? So he's not going to want to kind of make the same kind of changes. He's not going to put his neck out, and he's not going to take risks, and he's not going to learn from it. And so removing blame from this equation was really important for us. And so this idea of blamelessness was started. It kind of comes from a bunch of research that was done in safety engineering. And so it comes from like NASA and, the airline industry and, people that do big engineering, big safety things. And it tries to get rid of this idea of, localizing that problem, like coming up with that root cause. And it's really interesting. And so basically people at Etsy, so John Oswald, brought this to software engineering largely. And then it's kind of spread from there. And I think we've kind of always had it. Like in engineering and software engineering, we've always had this idea of blamelessness. We just never had the words for it. Like, I always felt bad for people who are doing operations jobs, who were like, clicking things and running commands instead of, writing software and deploying it. Because in software, we have a word for a mistake. Like we already have a term for it. We call it a bug, right? But we talk about it like it's organically grew in the system. We say like, this is a bug. Oh, there's a bug there. Like nobody put it there. It just grew. It didn't grow. Like somebody did put it there. But we have this useful terminology to say, actually, there's a bug in the system. We're going to fix it. Oh, good, we fixed a bug. That's what it is. We don't call the bug Dave. We don't call it. You don't give it a name. But it's already built into our terminology. When we do this in operations, we tend to call this operator error. And so it's not as useful. We need another term for that, to be honest. We don't have one. And so I think blamelessness is something we need to agree upon and we need to do. And building that into your post-mortem process is quite important, because when you remove blame, a lot of people think you remove accountability. You actually don't. You get an increase in accountability. Accountability is somebody's ability to give their account, right? Which is the opposite of the impact of blame, right? And if you don't have blame, somebody's more likely to give their account. And so you get accountability. And so when we do postmortems and people aren't being blamed for it, they say, oh, if I'd have known this, I would have done that. Oh, cool. Maybe we can make this more obvious. There's a really good mitigation. That's something we've learned together as part of this process.
Mm.
And so it's building in those feedback loops. And I think when I think about this, like when we go through like a post-mortem process, we often ignore, like, we talked about this kind of root cause thing, we're kind of trying to get to the root causes. Really, we have to accept that looking back on incidents, we have these biases that kick in. There's like hindsight that kind of kicks in. There's, outcome bias, like we know what went wrong. So how could you have done this? Given what's happened, how could you have made this decision? These aren't useful ways of looking at failure. Really, it's like a maze, right? If you're looking at a maze top down and you're watching somebody walk through the maze and they take a left, you say, why did you take a left? You obviously don't take a left, take a right. They don't know that.
Yeah. If
you change your perspective and look from their perspective, you see, actually, we should have put a signpost saying, go right. Like, this is obvious at the time. Like, it wasn't to them. Like, they didn't know which way to go. And so if you fix that problem, you can end up with better outcomes. And this is all part of the blameless postmortem. It's changing your perspective and looking at it so that somebody can give more account, and then you can learn from it really, really easily. And so once we implemented this, this became a really useful tool for learning as quickly as we could on the fly and growing as quickly as possible. Building a lot of that learning back into our culture and then moving forward with all of that knowledge.
Within the organization, who's responsible for creating the blameless culture? Is it one individual? Is it collective? Where does this come from? Where did it come from at Pushpay? Did it come from you? Did it come from someone else?
So originally, like, the person that brought it to the company or kind of decided that this was a thing we should look at and do was, like, as I said, our previous VP of engineering, Josh Robb. But I mean, who's responsible for keeping that culture going? All of us are.
Exactly.
Right? All of us are. You need permission, sure. Like the way that a normal organizational structure works, like you do need the permission to do this. And so that is something you'd often have to break the back of and say, hey, look, this, like exactly the arguments I said, like this is what blame does. This is what accountability does. This is how we're hoping to learn, and this is what you're going to get because of it. And then building that into the culture so that everybody understands, and it gets to every partner, every engineer, every participant, every customer support person, every salesperson. Everybody has to start to understand how this works, because the minute we start pointing fingers, this whole thing breaks down. And so we need to have that that culture upheld by everybody in the organization. And so it doesn't roll up to one person, which would again, recreate the whole blame scenario. And so we need this to permeate everything that we do. So building it into your company values, building it into the way that you speak about failures, building it into the processes, all of this is really, really important.
What if the finger is pointed at someone or a group of people? What happens then?
Well,
or does that ever happen?
Do you mean at Pushpay or generally in like an engineering?
Well, we can talk about, from Pushpay specifically, but maybe, I'm just trying to understand, like, if it does, has it happened ever, and how's it dealt with?
From a Pushpay situation, we don't see this, like we've set a pretty good norm around this. You'll see it creep in kind of, like sometimes you can see little micro kind of aggressions, and you might find it, you might see it, or you might see a kind of a roll of the eyes or something like this going, oh, did you really have to do that? Did you really have to break it? Like this sort of language, you just have to get rid of pretty easily. Like I've been in other companies where blame has most certainly been an aspect. And what I find is that it stifles that person. It essentially just stops them dead in their tracks. And it would do. I mean, if you think about any time, like how you feel whenever you've been blamed for something, like ultimately, everybody comes to work to do a good job. Unless you're hiring out of a really weird pool of people that I've never met, there's no way that these people are coming to work just to mess things up. All right. And so if you assume that everybody's coming to work to do a good job, then surely it's the system that's the problem, right? You hire good people, they have good intentions. So when problems happen, is it the person? No, it's the system, right? And so it's the systems and the processes that we build that are at fault. And we should improve those systems and processes to protect those people as well as the business, right? We need to protect them from the feeling of, this is my problem, I screwed this up. Really, we want to protect them from that and actually say, hey, look, now this is a systemic failure. All of us are responsible for building this system. You just happen to be the one that shipped code that that brought this to life. And so actually there is, testing should have been in place to make sure this couldn't happen. If you have testers, etc., that conversation didn't happen to tell them exactly where to test or how to understand the scope of the change. When it goes into production, to be have the right monitoring in place to detect this as early as possible. All of those things are a factor of the system, and no one person is responsible for them all.
Okay, thanks. What is a postmortem? Talk to me a bit more about a postmortem and what that looks like at Pushpay. So when something goes wrong, how do you obviously you're measuring it. Out at the end of that, something goes wrong. What do you do?
Yeah. And so immediately, as soon as possible after the incident has happened, so there's part of incident response, which is finding out, getting alerted, forming roles like incident commander and scribe and operator, and you have these different people involved in an incident. Once the incident closes and you all agree that it's resolved and that we've recovered, then as soon as possible, you've got to get into that, write down the timeline, right? The reason this is important is because human memory is a horrible thing. And again, once you've had a conversation with a couple of people, or you've kind of, you've all there's a swell of kind of understanding or assumptions that are happening somewhere, then you'll change recollection of history. And so you need to write down everything that's happened. We use Slack, for example, for all of our kind of communications during incidents, because it makes a really nice timeline of things that have happened.
Yeah.
And so you got to build that timeline as soon as possible. And that's that perspective of going through that maze. That's the thing that you're building. You're drawing that kind of line, like your kids do in those books, that's the line that you want to see. You want to see exactly what happened. And you also want to capture what they were thinking at the time as much as possible. So you get all of that down. If it's the middle of the night, go to sleep, forget about it, wake up the next day, and you start pulling together impact analysis. You start pulling together other perspectives. Who else, what tickets did we have from customers? All of this type of stuff. Get as much information as you can. Build that all into a document, and then have a discussion. Now, the discussion is a hard part, because again, that whole language of blame and language of postmortems, even just the language of postmortems, it's often it's quite a severe way to even describe, looking at an incident.
Yeah, it is.
Picking over the parts, some carcass or something. It's not, it's not helpful at times, but it's an industry accepted term, so we're kind of stuck with it. But looking through a postmortem in those details, you need to talk about it in certain terms, like, hey, not necessarily why did you do that instead of this? You don't ask questions like that. You ask what information were you looking at the time? What information was available to you? What were you thinking? How were you feeling? All of these types of things. Was there anything else going on that we is not in here? And so trying to get all of that information down inside a discussion, inside a document. Typically, what comes out of that is a few things. One of the things that people look for is mitigations. And so mitigations are normally work items like tickets or Jira tickets or whatever system you use, to then get actions as soon as possible, improve alerting, fix the bug, whatever it might be. And so there are mitigations as well. But the important thing is that you capture what was happening during the discussion. So this is the part that is the learning for everyone. For us, we have those post-mortem documents and the discussions circulated with everybody in engineering. And so everybody gets to see them. We even circulate them wider than engineering through the whole company, to be honest. And so pretty much anybody can see what exactly happened during an incident. Because reading them and watching them is a great way to learn. And it's not just for the team that were involved, it's everybody should be able to learn from it. And there's no, again, as long as there's no blame, this is a pretty risk-free process.
Who's in the postmortems? Is it just the SRE team? Is it the wider team? Who's going to be present during these meetings?
Anybody involved in the incident. So this could be some SREs. It could be some engineers from a product engineering team. It could be some customer support people. It could be anybody, to be honest, within the company. There could have been, somebody from finance if there was a billing problem. It could have been, whoever was involved in the incident at all had a role to play. And so all of those people are involved in the postmortem meeting. We've also extended this recently to have a facilitator, and so somebody that is essentially trained up in how to facilitate these meetings. As I said, language is really important, and the way that the meetings are conducted is really important so that you protect everybody involved and so that you're kind to everybody involved. And so it often takes special training in order to do well. And so we have a facilitator normally who looks after those meetings as well.
Where does the future look like? Because we've talked about obviously where you're at presently. Where would you like? How far can this go? Because obviously it's an evolving thing, right? Where do you see the gaps at Pushpay? How can it get better? How can the process get better?
I think just from like a postmortem and incident response type thing, or like wider and.
If you want to start at the incident response, and then let's go a bit further out.
Yeah. So from an incident response, I think there's we have to keep learning from this process. It's kind of funny. Like at one point, I felt like we were doing this wrong, and a few of us did as well at the same time because we were engineers. So engineers like to optimize problems. Like to automate things as much as possible. We kind of automated our postmortem process to the point at which we weren't learning as much from it. We were just, getting it over and done with as soon as possible and moving on. And so we fixed that with the facilitation process because that actually made this a lot better so that we concentrated on the learning. And that just taught us that you're never done. You're going to have to keep reflecting on these processes that you have in place, all of these kind of cultural things that you have, and seeing how you can improve them. So I think we're never done as far as like postmortem and incident response is involved at Pushpay. I think we're going to keep trying to iterate on them. Then I think like spreading it to the wider part of the company. And so like if there was a billing problem, if there was, customer support problem, if there was an issue in sales, like shouldn't you think about running an incident response process there and a postmortem process there and see what you can learn from it? Because you can apply this to pretty much any discipline you like. If you like everybody needs to learn from failures. There's a great quote, I don't know where it comes from, but it's like playing computer games, you get experience points from winning and succeeding.
Yeah.
Which is not how this normally works. You get experience points from failures. Right? That's where the real learning comes in. And so everybody can learn from this in any discipline. And so building in this postmortem process to the rest of the business is something we're working on. And also the way we respond to incidents right across the business, trying to align all of that together. And so that's where I think like incident response is going. I think generally, from engineering's point of view, where are things going? We're always looking to, again, learn more. So there are more scaling problems. Like COVID has been really interesting. So how do you adapt to a changing landscape, and where in our case churches are all going online, for example. And so there's always new ways that life's going to throw up new ways of trying making you adapt. And so also just growing people and growing your culture. How can we do different things? Like in the engineering discipline as a whole, like how can we improve inclusiveness and diversity in engineering across as an industry, which is a real problem we're dealing with at the moment. And I think that's a great thing for us to always try and improve on. So yeah.
Is there anything specifically which Pushpay have needed to improve because of the lockdowns and because of the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we definitely saw an increased amount of traffic. We had to adapt to that. And so, out of that, we learned a lot of things. As I say, this process is constantly continuing. And so figuring out how to best make the most out of cloud platforms so that you can scale as adaptively as you can, how to offset some of the impacts of those types of things. We're seeing similar things these days in, the NZX, for example, is now, getting hit by DDoS attacks. And so, this is really interesting for a lot of people as well. This is something that's not been seen in New Zealand that much. And so there are lots of things that we can constantly learn from in that way. And like COVID has definitely taught us a few lessons in Pushpay about how to adapt more quickly. But again, we already had the process set up to learn from this. It was just a matter of adapting as fast as we could. And that's something I think that will stand us well even into the future.
Yeah, no problem. Well, hey, look, that's everything that I've got from my side, really. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it, Peter. Until next time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You take care.